Literature Whiz presents
To Kill a Mockingbird, by Harper Lee. Analysis. Part 1. Chapter 1. The story that constitutes almost the entirety of To Kill a Mockingbird is set in the time between Scout Finch's 5th and 9th birthdays, but Scout presumably commences the first-person narrative that opens the novel much later in her life. As a result, the narrative voice fluctuates between the child's point of view, chronicling the events as they happen, and the adult voice, looking back on her childhood many years later. The child's naive voice dominates the central plot, allowing the reader to make connections and understand events in a way that the young Scout does not. At the same time, the narrative often digresses into anecdotes or descriptions presented retrospectively, like Scout's depiction of Maycomb in the first chapter. Maycomb was an old town, but it was a tired old town when I first knew it. Somehow, it was hotter then. People moved slowly then. Here, Lee's language indicates an adult's recollection rather than a girl's experience. Structurally, To Kill a Mockingbird is circular. The story begins where it ends. The first line of the novel introduces Jem's broken arm, and the novel then flashes back to cover the events leading up to his accident. The narrator uses this device to provide background for the Finch family, introducing the legendary Simon Finch and his 3 descendants. But at this stage of the novel, the family history is treated as background information, of secondary importance to the private world of the young Finch children. In this way, the first chapter provides only a brief sketch of Atticus, whose importance increases as the novel progresses. Jem and Scout are the center of the story, filling it with their world of imagination and superstition, centered on town myths such as the curious history of Boo Radley and imaginative diversions such as acting out stories from books. Dill dominates this early part of the novel. He is only a summer visitor, with no connection to Maycomb's adult world. As this adult world asserts itself later in the novel, Dill fades from the story. For now, however, the novel appropriates Dill's childhood perspective and only hints at the darker, more adult problems that will intrude on Jem and Scout. One of the central themes of To Kill a Mockingbird is the process of growing up and developing a more mature perspective on life. Correspondingly, the narrative gradually comes to mirror a loss of innocence, as the carefree childhood of this first chapter is slowly replaced by a darker, more dangerous, and more cynical adult story in which the children are only minor participants. Boo Radley becomes the focus of the children's curiosity in Chapter 1. As befits the perspective of childhood innocence, the recluse is given no identity apart from the youthful superstitions that surround him. Scout describes him as a malevolent phantom over 6 feet tall who eats squirrels and cats. Of course, the reader realizes that there must be more to Boo's story than these superstitions imply. Eventually, Boo will be transformed from a nightmare villain into a human being, and the children's understanding of him will reflect their own journey toward adulthood. Chapter 2-3. Scout's unpleasant first day of school has a threefold purpose. It locates the reader's sympathies firmly with the narrator, it offers a further introduction to Maycomb's tortured social ladder, and it provides sharp social commentary on the theme of children and education, one of the book's most important themes. In her interactions with Miss Caroline, Scout is victimized by her teacher's inexperience. Scout means well but receives only punishment in return. The rigid, impersonal protocols demanded by the law and by Miss Caroline's method of teaching are shown to be insufficient and irrational. Burris Ewell can keep the law happy by coming to school only 1 day a year, while Scout incurs her teacher's wrath simply by learning to read at an early age. This topsy-turvy educational outlook fails catastrophically to meet the needs of either student. Scout, who is commonsensical enough to perceive this failure immediately, is frustrated by her inability to understand why her teacher acts as she does, and why she, Scout, continually incurs disfavor for well-intentioned actions. Throughout these chapters, Scout's well-meaning missteps, telling the teacher about Walter's poverty, criticizing Walter for putting molasses on his meat and vegetables, earn harsh rebukes from the adult world, emphasizing the contrast between the comfortable, imaginative childhood world that Scout occupies in Chapter 1 and the more grown-up world she is now expected to occupy. This interaction sets a pattern for the book and for the basic development of Scout as a character. Whether dealing with adults or with other children, Scout always means well, and her nature is essentially good. Her mistakes are honest mistakes, and while there is evil all around her in the novel, it does not infect her, nor does injustice disillusion her, as it does Jem. At the end of Chapter 2, Scout, acting on her best intentions, as always, tries to explain the Cunninghams to Miss Caroline. Young Walter Cunningham is the first glimpse we get of the Cunningham clan, part of the large population of poor farmers in the land around Macomb. Walter's poverty introduces the very adult theme of social class into the novel. Scout notes in Chapter 1 that Macomb was a rundown town caught up in the Great Depression, but so far, we have seen only the upper-class side of town, represented by relatively successful and comfortable characters such as Atticus. Now, however, we begin to see the rest of Macomb, represented by the struggling Cunninghams and the dirt-poor Yules. Jem later divides Macomb into 4 social classes, placing the Cunninghams a level beneath the other families in the town. Walter's fondness for molasses on all of his food illustrates the difference in status between his family and the Finches. A correlation between social status and moral goodness becomes evident as the novel progresses. At the top of this pyramid rests Atticus, a comparatively wealthy man whose moral standing is beyond reproach. Beneath him are the poor farmers such as the Cunninghams. The Yules are below even the Cunninghams on the social ladder, and their unapologetic, squalid ignorance and ill tempers quickly make them the villains of the story. We do not encounter them again until Part 2, but Burris's vicious cruelty in this section foreshadows the later behavior of his father, Bob Yule. Miss Caroline's teaching methods, meanwhile, facilitate Lee's subtle critique of educational orthodoxy. Miss Caroline cannot accept that Scout already knows how to read and write, because it confounds the teaching formula that she has been taught to implement. She adheres strictly to a method that she learned from adults, instead of learning from her experiences in the classroom and adapting her teaching accordingly. To Scout, this method is dull. To the reader, it exemplifies how well-meaning but rigid thinking can fail. Just as Atticus encourages Scout to place herself in another person's position before she judges that person, Miss Caroline would do better to try to think like her students and respond to their needs rather than simply trying to impose an external system on their education. Throughout the novel, Atticus's moral position of sympathy and understanding is contrasted with rigid, impersonal systems such as Miss Caroline's that fail to account for individual necessities. In this sense, Miss Caroline's behavior in the schoolhouse foreshadows the courtroom scenes later in the novel, when the system that fails is not an educational technique but the law. Chapter 4-6. These chapters serve primarily as a record of Jem and Scout's childhood adventures with Dill and the specter of Boo Radley. Even as the children play the Boo Radley game, make their attempts to give a message to Boo, and peek through his shutters, Boo's character is transformed from a monster into a human being. Although Boo's relevance to the main plot of the novel is still unknown, the compelling human story that these chapters weave around Boo keeps the reader interested in him, even if he serves only as a diversion to the young Finch children at this point. Boo makes his presence felt in these chapters in a number of ways. First, the presents begin to appear in the Radley tree, and, though Scout does not realize who has been putting them there, the reader can easily guess that it is Boo. Second, Miss Maudie offers insight into the origins of Boo's reclusiveness and a sympathetic perspective on his story. Miss Maudie has only contempt for the superstitious view of Boo. He is no demon, and she knows that he is alive, because she hasn't seen him carried out yet. From her point of view, Boo was a nice boy who suffered at the hands of a tyrannically religious family. He is one of many victims populating a book whose title, To Kill a Mockingbird, suggests the destruction of an innocent being. In fact, as a sweet, young child apparently driven mad by an overbearing father obsessed with sin and retribution, Boo epitomizes the loss of innocence that the book, as a whole, dramatizes. For the children, who first treat him as a superstition and an object of ridicule but later come to view him as a human being, Boo becomes an important benchmark in their gradual development of a more sympathetic, mature perspective. In these chapters, the first person other than Atticus to display a sympathetic attitude toward Boo is Miss Maudie, who, like Boo, emerges as an important character in this section. Miss Maudie is one of the book's strongest, most resilient female characters. One of the few people in the town who share Atticus's sense of justice, she is also Scout's closest friend and confidant among the local women. Atticus's wife is dead, leaving Scout with Miss Maudie and Aunt Alexandra as her principal maternal figures. Whereas the latter provides a vision of proper womanhood and family pride, the former offers Scout understanding instead of criticizing her for wearing pants and not being ladylike. Miss Maudie is a stronger role model for Scout. She serves as a conscience for the town's women, just as Atticus does for the men, and her sharp tongue and honesty make her the opposite of vapid gossips like Stephanie Crawford. Chapter 7-8. Originally portrayed as a freak and a lunatic, Boo Radley continues to gain the sympathy of the children in these chapters. Lee uses an elliptical technique in telling Boo's story. She hints and implies at what is happening without ever showing the reader directly. The reader must read between the lines, inferring, for instance, that it was Boo Radley who mended Jem's pants and placed the presents in the tree, since Scout does not realize that Boo's hand is at work until Jem explains things to Atticus after the fire. In comparison to Scout's still very childish perspective, Jem's more mature understanding of the world is evident here, along with his strong sense of justice. When Nathan Radley plugs up the hole in the tree, Scout is disappointed but hardly heartbroken, seeing it as merely the end of their presence. Jem, on the other hand, is brought to tears, because he grasps that Boo's brother has done something cruel. He has deprived Boo of his connection to the wider world and has broken up his brother's attempt at friendship. This incident, which the reader must detect behind the scenes of Scout's narrative, plays into the novel's broad theme of suffering innocence, and Jem's anger at this injustice foreshadows his later fury concerning Tom Robinson's trial. While Scout retains her innocence and optimism throughout the book, Jem undergoes severe disillusionment as part of his growing up, and the Boo Radley incident in this chapter is an important early step toward that disillusionment. The implicit comparison between Boo's soap figures and Jem and Scout's snowman reveals the difference in how each party interacts with others. Whereas Boo carves his figures out of a desire to connect with the two kids, Jem and Scout craft their snowman out of a dislike for Mr. Avery. Further, Boo doesn't make his carvings for himself, rather, he offers them as presents. Jem and Scout, on the other hand, make the snowman purely for their own enjoyment. Boo interacts with others on their terms, while the children, not yet mature, interact with others on their own terms. Critic Claudia Durst-Johnson has argued that To Kill a Mockingbird contains many Gothic elements, from the legends and secrets surrounding Boo Radley to Dill's imaginative stories and the children's superstitions. The unseasonable snow and the fire at Miss Maudie's, as well as the later appearance of a mad dog, can be seen as contributing to a sense of supernatural foreboding leading up to the injustice that pervades Tom Robinson's trial. This interpretation, however, is balanced by the fact that both the snow and the fire bring out the best in people. School is cancelled, Scout and Jem build a fine snowman, the neighbors help save Miss Maudie's belongings, and Miss Maudie perseveres after her house is destroyed. Even when she sees her prize flowers ruined, the brave old woman does not despair. Instead, she offers a cheerful comment about wanting a smaller house and a larger garden. This interweaving of dramatic, Gothic atmospherics and good-hearted small-town values epitomizes To Kill a Mockingbird and mirrors the novel's main theme. In a world in which innocence is threatened by injustice, cruelty, prejudice, and hatred, goodness can prevail in the form of sympathy, understanding, and common sense, as evidenced by how the townspeople's affectionate willingness to help one another enables them to overcome the intrusion of these Gothic elements into their simple small-town lives. Chapter 9-11. The casual tone with which Scout uses a racial slur suggests that she's not necessarily using it in a malicious way, rather, she's parroting language she's heard others use. Atticus's reproof of this language, however, suggests that he understands that speaking about black people in this way deprives them of dignity. While using a more appropriate term, Atticus uses Negro at various points in the novel, which suggests that this was proper at the time, shows respect. By being truthful with Scout about what's going on and what's going to happen, in other words, by not sheltering her, Atticus gives her the opportunity to grapple with adult ideas, and in doing so, helps her both grow and come to a better understanding of how her world works. When Atticus insists that he has to defend Tom in order to maintain the high ground, it indicates that for Atticus, helping others preserve their dignity is doing the right thing, even if he knows he won't be successful. Scout's refusal to mention Aunt Alexandra's husband reminds the reader that this is truly a child's account, with all her opinions and thoughts added in. The reader should thus take what Scout says about things with a grain of salt, as it's impossible for her to look at the world with anything other than her young perspective. When even Scout's beloved Uncle Jack tries to talk her into being ladylike, it reminds the reader that Scout doesn't fit into people's conceptions of what a young girl should be like. In this sense, if she were to think about it, she's a lot like Boo. He, too, doesn't fit into what people believe Maycomb's residents should act like. Scout's inability to make this leap, however, speaks to her youth and innocence, as does her use of rude language. Scout's query of what a whorelady is betrays that she has no idea what she's saying. She simply uses words because she hears them and picks up on the fact that they're offensive. Again, while this doesn't excuse her use of slurs, it does indicate that she's generally not using them in a calculating and purposefully racist way. She's only doing it for attention. Asking for Uncle Jack to be fair with her also shows that her sense of right and wrong is well developed, even if she's not fully aware of how her world functions. Maycomb's usual disease is likely a reference to racism, which Atticus is clearly aware exists in force, even if it's not really on Scout's radar yet. His advice to Uncle Jack to answer children's questions truthfully again shows that Atticus believes children are capable of hearing about adult concepts, even if they don't totally understand them. When Scout refers to her choice to follow Atticus's request as a policy of cowardice, it shows that she still thinks courage and bravery have to do with the way a person fights physically or verbally for what they believe in. In other words, it hasn't yet crossed her mind that it might be more courageous for her to walk away from others' taunts. Atticus's request that the children not kill innocent mockingbirds harkens to his defense of Tom Robinson, who is being persecuted by the community. When Miss Maudie echoes what Atticus said, it helps the children see that within Atticus's sense of morality is based on universal concepts of right and wrong that everyone can apply. Scout and Jem's disappointment with the fact that Atticus apparently can't do anything again suggests that both of them think of courage and personal worth as coming from an individual's tangible capabilities. Keep in mind that to Jem and Scout, Calpurnia's willingness to run right up to the Radleys' front door may look either wildly misguided or very courageous, since they're still wary of Boo. Calpurnia's actions also make the case that she feels as though she's an essential part of Maycomb and, just like Scout's other neighbors, can and should do everything in her power to protect others from the rabid dog. Scout's aside that Tim's behavior is scarier because it's not what she expected from a rabid dog shows again that what Scout fears most of all is the unknown. Even outright threats aren't as frightening as something that's entirely surprising. The fact that the street also looks eerie when it's empty and closed up nods to the idea that even in February, Scout expects her neighborhood to be open and welcoming, seeing that it has the potential to not be as very off-putting. Atticus is very clearly comfortable handling a rifle, thereby throwing a wrench into Scout and Jem's belief that he can't do anything. This begins to suggest that Atticus may have any number of skills, but that he doesn't choose to use them unless it's wholly necessary to do so in order to protect his family and his community. Jem is so ecstatic to learn that Atticus is a good shot, as it falls into line with what Jem believes about courage and worth coming from easily demonstrable skills, like shooting. The idea that it's a choice to use skills like this, however, suggests that there's more to this than Jem realizes, such as the possibility that Atticus might feel as though showing off his shooting skills would be incompatible with his morally upright image. Atticus's choice to greet Mrs. Dubose politely, even when she insults his own children on a daily basis, adds more evidence to the idea that Atticus believes treating an individual with respect is always the right thing to do, regardless of that person's behavior. Ignoring Mrs. Dubose or heckling her back would likely make her feel even meaner and less accepted by the community than she already is, whereas treating her kindly could yield positive results even if doing so is difficult. Jem's willingness to write Mrs. Dubose off comes from his youth, as he's not mature enough to consider that there might be an underlying reason for her behavior. Mrs. Dubose cultivates camellias, just like Miss Maudie, makes it clear that she's not an entirely evil person. Like the delightful and kind Miss Maudie, she takes pleasure in the natural world and wants to make it beautiful. This, however, doesn't excuse her nasty and rude behavior, as the abuse she slings at Scout and Jem here is clearly racist. As far as Scout is concerned, What everyone else in Maycomb thinks is probably right. Thus far, she's had little reason to question the status quo and whatever the majority believes since, for the most part, she's been a part of that majority, due to the fact that she's white and Atticus is a respected figure in town. This experience starts to show her what it's like to be on the outs, which will help her develop empathy for other people who are different and disliked. It doesn't seem as though Scout and Jem have much experience spending time with elderly people, which likely explains some of their fear and apprehension about being here. To an active and imaginative child, an elderly person who's confined to her bed, spews profanity, and seems unwell could be understandably unsettling. That Scout momentarily feels sorry for Mrs. Dubose shows that she certainly has the capacity to feel empathy and compassion for people who are very different from her, even if they're also scary. Atticus suggests here that when a person uses slurs, it simply shows how cruel and misguided the person is. In Scout's position of receiving these slurs, it says nothing bad about her. Keep in mind the fact that Scout is hearing this abuse from adults as well as children, which begins to create cracks in the idea that Maycomb is an idyllic place. There's a clear undercurrent of hate and racism in town that Scout is just beginning to see, even if Atticus implies that it's been here the entire time, just not on Scout's radar. Extending the alarm clock every day makes it clear to Scout that there's more going on here than just reading, even if she's not yet sure what. This again speaks to her capacity to understand some aspects of the adult world, even if she can't fully interpret them yet. That Mrs. Dubose's racist abuse continues even as she improves indicates that this is not just an anomaly due to her illness, but rather a feature of her personality. Her open expression of these sentiments also suggests that this mindset is common among adults in town, and that there are others who are just as racist as Mrs. Dubose. The camellia is a reminder to Jem to remember that for all her faults, Mrs. Dubose was a human being like anyone else, and like everyone else, she deserves kindness, respect, and to be remembered as being courageous and dignified in her own way. Atticus recognizes that this is one of the most important things he can teach his children, as learning this lesson will help them to be empathetic and caring in the future, especially when faced with people who are different. Thank you for watching. If you want the videos to continue, all you have to do is like and subscribe. You can share the books you want with us as comments. May the magic be with you.